Good morning, everyone. Welcome. With me today is Lisa Robinson, Senior Program Manager, and I'm Cindy Leonard, Program Manager of Our Driving Concern through the National Safety Council. We are part of the Transportation and Roadway Safety Department, and we're going to be talking today about distracted driving and specifically employer policies and what you really need to dial into and change, modify, and update if you haven't already. So hopefully the morning's going to be a good opportunity for you to really focus on transportation safety. And in particular, we know across all of the death and fatality risks that exist in the workplace, when we consider the roadway part of the workplace, then that becomes the #1 place in which unintentional fatalities occur during the day or during a work shift for somebody who's employed. And that surprises a lot of people because there's a lot of focus on other unintentional fatalities. You know, we tend to focus on the things that are occurring with falls, trips, and slips, and with active shooter and things like that. But transportation is actually the leading cause and remains the leading cause of fatalities in the workplace. So Lisa, I was going to have you talk a little bit today about what that means in terms of the tip of the iceberg.
Absolutely. You know, Cindy, you led off perfectly this morning, and I appreciate that because you really set the stage for people to understand that, you know, the driving aspect for an employee will be the most dangerous part of their day. Even when we talk about driving to work, from work, running that errand, driving is a part of their job. And you're right, fatalities are just the tip of the iceberg. You know, when we talk occupational fatalities for an employer, and you're right, we do that. You will see that employers occupationally do a great job when they think about safety, and they do think about, you know, slips, trips, and falls, and they think about all these other things. But sometimes, you know, that gets overlooked because we don't think about the driving aspect that's necessary to complete the actions of the job. So there's so many other things that happen that have like serious lifelong debilitating injury. And I hear this from insurance companies and people that work for insurance companies talking about that's what they see a lot of, you know, these serious lifelong debilitating injuries that are very costly for an employer, and, you know, they have long-term effects, right?
Absolutely.
And we know that the ER, we're talking about medical, right? There's going to be medical costs as well. And so there are many things that are costly for the employer, and it impacts the employees as well. It impacts the coworkers, you know, the workplace. If it's a small company, how deep are their pockets? How much can they sustain? So you have to understand that this really is a key component within an occupational safety program.
Wow. Lisa, you know, you highlighted a lot of really specific concerns, especially employer size and so many different roles that employees assume during the workday. You know, I think it's really interesting to look at what the top injuries are related to and what the top fatalities are. And occupationally, this may surprise some people. You know, we tend not to interview somebody for a job and ask them about their driving skills unless we're hiring them as a professional driver. And otherwise, most of us, especially within this region of the country where things are spread out, are going to be driving at some point during our workday. So we're going to be driving occupationally, and some of those things need to be considered. Lisa, you know, we tend to think that we're working really hard to drive down unintentional fatalities on the roadways, but we're actually seeing them increase, and we're kind of headed in the wrong direction. Fatal work injuries have increased year after year, and we know that many of these are due to human error. In fact, substantially, a number more, around 90%, are caused by human error. And we know that sometimes it's as simple as vehicle maintenance, making sure that the vehicle is ready for the job, ready for the road. And then there's a lot of environmental factors that come in. And sometimes it's really necessary for us to look ahead, see what the driver is going to be encountering, see what kinds of things may inhibit that safety in that drive.
Well, and you know, Cindy, you mentioned a couple of these key components, and I think they're also a part of the planning process. And, you know, some of those things that I think are really important.
Well, and we talk a little bit about that in some other webinars that we have on journey management that are really
Correct.
great tools to consider looking at as well. And the cell phone, none of this is surprising, right? We know that this is occupying our time, our minds, and getting our ability to drive very vulnerable at the same time.
Correct. Correct. And you know, Cindy, as you say, it's not surprising. It's really not surprising. This conversation about cell phones and distracted driving has been going on for a very long time. And we know that, daily we have people that are injured on our roadways. We know that people are dying daily, and we know that the majority of crashes, at least 25% are attributed to distracted driving. But we know the numbers underreported as well due to what can be, some things are not even reported to law enforcement, some aren't cited. If unless it's documented, you may not know what's occurring. But we do know that these are costly in the employer arena, and we do know that these are preventable. And so how, addressing it, I think, is really key. We know that about 62% of the employees who died were not motor vehicle operators by occupation, right? That was not the job that they were hired to do. And so knowing that tells me that maybe we aren't giving 100% of our employee population the same training and education. And we're not focusing on that. We're not thinking enough about every single person
Sure.
in our workplace, right? And we know a variety of industries, require that employee to drive or be exposed to hazards that are associated with driving, like that person maybe that's running an errand for the company, the person maybe who's picking up lunch for a lunch meeting, right? Or we think about the person who maybe that's what they do is mow and do tree trimming for a living, and we are focused on the aspects of that job, but not driving that vehicle and possibly that trailer to go do those job functions, just like you mentioned earlier, Cindy, right? And you made a comment that was very appropriate earlier at the beginning about the roadway is an extension of the workplace. We have to think about that roadway has to be considered when we think about it. What are we allowing to occur in that vehicle? Are there computers? Are there phones? What are we expecting? We've got to think about some of the
Mm.
policies, and we have to think about what we're doing when we've got employees behind that wheel, right? And we know that distracted driving is any time that you take your eyes off the road, hands off the wheel, and your mind off the primary task, right? That's driving safely. It prevents anyone from their full attention. You talk about this really well a lot of times, Cindy, whenever we're doing our driving concern training, and you do mention several key components about distracted driving, right?
Right.
And the
Well,
different
and
pieces.
And we like to consider a lot of different tasks as falling under these categories together. So we've got our visual distractions that are literally our eyes involved, right? And then manual distractions involve our hands on the wheel, our feet on the pedals, our ability to maneuver quickly to respond to things that are in front of us. And then our cognitive distraction, we tend to associate directly with our brain, but they actually fall together quite often and overlap each other. As an example, if I pick up my smoothie here to drink while I'm driving, I'm thinking about my smoothie and I'm also physically grabbing it. So I'm engaged in two different manual and cognitive distractions, and I'm just picking up a drink. This isn't a cell phone. This isn't a navigation system or something else that's really complex. So you can imagine that with greater complexity of the task, we're engaging more of these three components of distraction.
Oh, that's a great point, Cindy. That's a really good point. So tell us, what else are you hearing and seeing about distraction, and what do we hear from employers that they always share with us?
Well, we hear a lot of things. I think yesterday we heard about pantyhose being put on by somebody who was driving, and we know that 18-wheeler drivers tell us the best stuff because they're up high and they really see it all. But it's really important. I'm glad you're bringing the focus back away from the cell phone for a minute to consider that there are a lot of different things that people are doing while they're driving. And we sort of entered into this idea as drivers that we could do more than one thing when we put cup holders in cars. Remember, cars didn't used to have those.
Right.
So when we established that idea that you could grab a drink or grab my smoothie and drive while doing two things at once, we opened the gateways for cell phones to come into play. Remember, cell phones were considered car phones. And
Yes.
so somebody along the way said, well, if somebody can drink while they're driving, they might as well be able to talk on the phone. What a luxury. What an opportunity. Let's try this out. So, we have developed, even if you put your cell phone away, and I know you're really good to do that, and I'm really good to do that, there's still a cultural issue here at play where we've decided we can do more than one thing. And that's something that we've got to break down.
Well, and Cindy, I think so, yesterday during our training, we heard from people talking about the pets in the vehicle. They talked a lot about the
Yeah.
emotional state, what they've seen, the drivers, their behavior, road rage. Multiple of these things came up in our long training yesterday, and they really identified all of these different aspects. We know we talk a lot about cell phones because it tends to be, so much in the news, or you hear about it a lot, but all of these other things also affect that driver and the abilities.
Well, and I
Right?
think for the employer, it goes back to the distraction in the cell phone, because that can be policy driven. You can impact your policy directly by talking about cell phones directly in your policies, whereas some of these other things are a little bit more ancillary and they don't come up in court nearly as often as the cell phone use. So, it's really a good idea for any leader, and you're good at this as well, to make sure that you know what's going on with your team leaders, especially in times like we've had with COVID-19, or times that require transition, that are going to lead to more stress, to more management anxiety, to more details that might cause people not to be sleeping as well, not to be as well rested, and also to be distracted as a result. When one of your team members has something else going on in their life, and all of them do all of the time, uh, when they have something that's really complex, really stressful, it's good for you to know that and factor that in terms of how they should be engaging in activities that could result in risk or injury.
Well, and
And
you're right, because these are mental distractions, right, Cindy? These are mentally, and it's not something that you maybe as a safety leader would actually physically see.
oh, good point. Very good point. And Lisa, we like to compare. If you've got the cell phone slide up next, you see this cell phone we associate with distraction. And we can also associate the coronavirus and the COVID-19 molecule with distraction right now as well, because it's on everyone's mind. And so, dialing in and understanding what can be impacting your workplace is really key to mitigating risk.
Absolutely, absolutely. That's such a key point. And Cindy, you brought it up very well earlier whenever you introduced the fact that it's not just cell phones. And Injury Facts shares that when you look at all of the information, it's not just the cell phones. There's many other factors that are affecting our crashes. And so focusing only on cell phones is, going to be a misstep. We have to think just beyond the cell phone. It's an important aspect. Absolutely, the cell phones are very important. But you have to understand that your safety program has to address all these other aspects when we think about education, because it's not simply a cell phone that's causing our crashes. And we also know that when we look at industries and we look at, when you made a comment earlier, when you talked about the transportation, falls, slips, and trips, and it's important that we educate on absolutely all of these
Absolutely.
topics. You cannot not educate and communicate, but you have to understand that transportation has consistently led by about 50%, consistently across the board nationally. And so you have to understand that it deserves a good amount of attention. So are you giving transportation the same attention that you give these other areas? So it's really important to understand that when you look at this, it's not changing. It has been consistent. It has not gone up and down, which sometimes you see charts that go up and down, but we're not seeing this. And when you look at industries, right? Sometimes people think it's just this industry, that industry. No, it's all industries, every industry. And we talked about that because we said, what do people, when they do their job, what particular, group of people may be driving as a part of their job? Every industry is going to be affected in some way when we talk about the transportation piece. So you can't overlook that. It also is the same when we talk about ages. Sometimes people will say, well, my newer driver that we just hired. Well, no, we need to look at all ages. Sometimes we forget that complacency plays a part of it.
Yes.
Sometimes we assume because someone has a driver's license, maybe they're newly hired and they've had that driver's license for 15 or 20 years. They're a driver. They know how to drive. They have the license, right? So sometimes we overlook the aspect that a driver safety program should be for all of our employees, all ages, new hires, long-term employees, and it should be a consistent part of our safety and our driver safety program. We cannot overlook that aspect that every age group is represented. The data should help drive what you're doing, right? And
Absolutely.
again, we talk about that it's not just cell phones and non-distraction, affected, non-fatal ones when you look at motor vehicle crashes, right? Again, goes back to injury. This is similar to the fatalities when you still look that cell phones are a part of it, but it's everything else as well. So you talked a little bit about this whenever you've talked about, multitasking before. People think I am the best multitasker, right? Oh, I can do it. I'm a good driver. I'm the one who can do it. But the problem is there is no such thing as a multitasker. Your brain is overloaded. You cannot do two cognitive tasks. People switch attention without even recognizing the fact that they've done it. It makes one a primary task and the other secondary. So when that happens, the phone conversation becomes secondary. So when you're behind the wheel, that means your primary function is not driving. And that is whenever impairment, it takes several forms, which you mentioned before. And I know you're going to talk a little bit more about inattention blindness here.
Absolutely. Lisa, you brought up so many points, and I was thinking back to when I used to know you with the young twins and how good you were at multitasking when you were in the kitchen or the family room or inside the house, watching them play outside. But when it came to driving, everything was different. You had them buckled in, you had them restrained. They were less of a distraction and more of just part of your journey because the most important thing you were doing was driving. Now, when we think about inattention blindness, what comes into play in a very interesting scientific way is that your visual field changes regardless of the fact that you are looking straight ahead. And I'll tell you what that means. Here we see on the left, we see at the top somebody who is simply driving, looking straight ahead. The rectangle represents what they're seeing. The smaller rectangle directly below represents what they're seeing when they're listening to somebody talk on a cell phone. Now, this is a listening activity. This does not mean they're texting, looking at social media, engaged in anything other than listening to that conversation. Most likely, while they're listening to that conversation, their brain is involved in thinking about what they're going to respond with, right? And when their brain is overly involved in that listening, then their visual field is impacted. And I think this is science that people aren't really aware of, Lisa. When you have your hands on the wheel and your eyes on the road, you've also got to make sure your mind is on that driving task.
Well, and Cindy, you bring up a really good point when you talk about the scientific and the data here. We know that a lot of crashes that occur at intersections, whether we talk about a stoplight or a stop sign, and you talk about your field of vision, a lot of times people say, I never saw them coming, right? I never saw it, right? And so it's kind of like those blinders that come up, you miss what's going on around you.
That's
and
right.
So it's easy to miss those safety cues that you need to make sure that you're sharp when it comes
That's
to
right,
driving.
Lisa. Your brain is only processing what it can determine is most important. You don't exactly direct that. Your brain takes over and makes that decision for you, and it can't process everything all at once. And here's another example of how we see the parietal lobe shift. We see activity decrease when somebody is listening to that conversation versus when they are just driving. So, I love science to help us understand what we pretty much already know, right? Logically, we already know that this is the case, but here we have good evidence and good proof.
Well, let's talk a little bit about the myths, Cindy. We cover this quite a bit, and I think it's so important because people, automatically assume, and they'll ask some of these same questions. Well, we know CB radios, they're really not problematic. It's a simplex conversation. It's usually very short in duration, and it's very quick. Usually CB radios are not a real issue, and people like to bring those up.
It's true. We get these questions when we start talking about the brain, and they're valid questions. So it's a great opportunity here to bust a few of these myths and talk about them a little bit.
And I like the fact when you talk about sentences, because we know that, when people talk about, well, it's no more dangerous than talking to a passenger, we know that's not true. We know that when you talk to a passenger, they see everything around you. right? The conversation, we're thinking about the same things, we're talking about the same things, so we know what goes on with that passenger is different than that phone conversation. The person on the phone can't see their, your surroundings, and your passenger is actually a co-pilot. They will help you see things. Cindy, you and I have been in the car multiple times, right? You and I have been
We've
in the
had some adventures for sure.
and we've helped each other navigate. Sometimes I've said, hey,
Yes,
do you see that
always.
car? Both of you and I have done that when we've been in a conversation. It may stop and one of us will say, oh, by the way, do you see that? So there's a big difference really between the phone conversation and that passenger.
Absolutely. And the other thing that we do is we help each other navigate. Whoever is driving is not the primary person looking at the directions. The
Correct.
passenger can do that. There's lots of ways that a passenger can be directly engaged in helping with that process.
I do like to also mention here sometimes, Cindy, that this does not apply to teenagers. We're talking about adults. We're talking occupationally adults. We're not talking teenagers, because this is
Excellent
not the
point.
same case when it comes to teens. I want to be real clear because we talk about adults here, okay?
Right. Our
So
data shows that teen drivers with more teen occupants are more distracted. So I'm glad you mentioned that, Lisa. Very important point.
well, and people want to say, well, it's no more dangerous, right? But we know that there's not enough evidence to prove because it's difficult to collect the data. We know that, again, I always tell people if you watch Live PD or any of those type cop shows, no one gets out of the car and says, officer, I was just on my phone. Oh, officer, I was distracted by this. Oh, no one's really, immediately says this is what occurred, right? And so just because there's no statistic on it does not mean that it's not happening, right?
Right.
And it's important that employers are collecting the data to know why the crashes are occurring. It's important for them to know. Voice texting, I always love this one, Cindy, because we've all seen those missed texts, right? They're
Right.
humorous.
They're humorous, and we thought voice texting would enable us to talk and communicate via text while we're driving. But in fact, it does something very different. What does it do, Lisa?
Well, it's more distracting actually, because first of all, after after you've voice texted, right? You have to stop, you have to read it, your eyes are off the road, and majority of times there's going to be a correction you need to make, right?
Mm-hmm.
So
Mm-hmm.
honestly, you actually look away more when you're doing it. And it took longer to send that voice text. So honestly, neither are safer. And so, but people believe because we can do it, it's safer, right? And people need to understand that hands-free and crash risk, hands-free does not reduce crash risk. People believe, oh, we're hands-free, just like you said, right? There's been many reports that tell us that hands-free is no safer. And so, people want to say, oh, well, our policy says as long as we're Bluetooth, as long as we're hands-free, we're fine. But understanding that that is not reducing your crash risk. So that's an important piece. And Cindy, how about talking about some of the risky behaviors? Because you talked earlier about pantyhose. We've heard about
Well,
grooming,
yeah,
movies.
absolutely. Lisa, a lot of people will tell you, in fact, as many as 96, 97% of people surveyed will tell you texting is something that's dangerous while they're driving. And yet, that's in that same survey, you'll see that at least a third of them will admit that they have texted in the last 30 days. Now, that's just who's admitting it. Remember, you referenced the fact that nobody gets out of the car and says, police officer, I was doing X, Y, and Z. I made a mistake. And in our minds, we tend to be pretty much good ambassadors of erasing what we've done as well. So, our stats tell us that a lot of people are doing a lot of things they know are risky while they're driving. And here's a few examples. More than 70% of people reported talking on a cell phone in the last 30 days. 31% report doing this pretty often. And that's who's reporting on themselves. 42% admit that they've been reading a text. And we know that if you're reading a text and you start engaging in that text, it's as though your eyes are closed. Who drives with
Right.
their eyes closed intentionally, Lisa? But we
And
are seeing a lot of people do texting while they drive.
who wants to be a passenger in the vehicle of somebody with their eyes closed or share the road with that, right?
Absolutely. So these numbers paint a different picture for us, and they amplify the impact that we can have on getting this information in front of our employees and giving them the awareness that they need to respond and reduce risk.
Well, and understand that each person has a responsibility here instead of saying, but I'm the exception to the rule, right?
Yeah, absolutely. And that's hard. That's a tough pill to swallow. I tell the people around me, be the safest driver you can be today. Be safer than you were yesterday, because there's none of us that is absolutely perfect, but you're making choices every time you're behind the wheel. Make those the safest choices. They love to hear those messages. And you know, when we look back occupationally, we see a big staggering cost for the employer. Whether you're thinking about this directly or not as part of your role in your employ, there are big numbers associated with these types of things that all, as you see, have to do with behavior and choice and are preventable.
Absolutely.
Drinking and driving, absolutely preventable. Wearing a seatbelt, cheap and easy. All of these are preventable, and all of these cost us dearly in the employer arena.
Absolutely. And I appreciate you talking about, you know, because you talked about on and off the job are effective for the employer and costly. I mean, there's so many costs that this employer pays, and you got to think about liability. You know, liability is very costly, and it drives a lot of decisions that employers make. And so when we start thinking about our safety programs and our education and our outreach and what we're doing, we've got to understand that liability absolutely and risk drive what employers do. Absolutely. And we know that when we talk hands-free, we know that somebody had shared it, even when an employee was talking on a personal cell phone, personal time, personal vehicle, and there was a crash, the employer was held liable because it was common practice. So we have to understand that, you know, as far as risk, we need to really look into it and make decisions that protect the company, the bottom line, and the employees, and addresses those risks. And we've really got to look at it. You know, and collecting information will help employees make those decisions. And there's a lot of considerations that employers have to think about. They've got to think about the roadway, they've got to think about the training, and they've got to think about the policies, right? Not one piece, they need all three pieces. Do you want to set the stage for this, Cindy?
Absolutely. So Lisa, we're going to see a video now that amplifies and enunciates the reasons why we think cell phone ban policy is really key to helping an employer save their bottom line and, of course, mitigate risks that are dangerous and potentially deadly.
Juries all over this country are reacting very strongly to distracted driving cell phone crashes. They're awarding very, very large damages amount. Any employer that does not have an enforced ban on cell phones are putting their company at financial risk.
Many distractions exist while driving, but cell phones are a top distraction because of the amount of risk and the time that drivers spend on the phone every day. Using hands-free devices is not the solution. The National Safety Council has reviewed more than 30 studies that show that hands-free devices don't make driving any safer because the brain remains distracted by the conversation.
911, what is your emergency?
Hi, I have a semi driver. He just ran over a semi.
County 911.
He just ran over a man.
And could you see the driver at all, or did?
Yes.
Did you see where he was looking, or could you tell what he was doing?
I would be 90% positive. I'm thinking he was on the phone.
You think he was on the phone?
Yeah. And he had earpiece in there. He was talking.
When one of these tragic crashes happen, that indeed the company, from the lowest employee to the highest safety officer in the company, has to answer very hard questions that are impossible to answer effectively, because indeed, without an enforced ban, the company is left to defend something that's indefensible.
Without a best practice cell phone policy, you expose your workers to unnecessary crash risks. At the National Safety Council, we recommend a best practice policy that covers handheld and hands-free devices, all employees, all company vehicles, all company cell phones, and all work-related communications, even in a personal vehicle or on a personal cell phone. You don't want to end up in litigation. You can make our roads safer for everyone by putting a policy in place to eliminate not just handheld use, but the hands-free use of cell phones while driving. It's not just smart business, but most importantly, you're keeping your people safe. For more information, visit nsc.org/policykit. Thank you.
Well, you know, Lisa, we use this video quite often because we know it enunciates some really key points. And here's just a little checklist that we've put together to encourage driver safety behavior, regardless if it's part of your policy or we're talking about personal friends and family. You know, we recommend that you turn that cell phone off, put it out of reach. Don't be distracted by that ping that you get when you know you're getting a message, because that will take you off of the task cognitively. We know planning ahead is really good. So if you've got long drives, plan those breaks, because if you don't plan them, you might not take them and you might push through. We also know that voice features, as we said, are really distracting, and you need to set up that GPS and know where you're going before you drive. Social media can absolutely wait. It's another temptation, and it's not necessary when you're driving. And we want you to also be encouraged to park in a safe place, make calls and check emails if you need to. You can pull off of the road if you're not on the highway safely within a matter of 5 to 10 minutes if you feel that you need to be checking on something. And absolutely do not call or text coworkers, friends, or family while you're driving. These are habits. And this is part of a system that encourages you to break down some of those habits and keep us all safe as a result. And the National Safety Council, with our driving concern particularly, has a great program and training on the 5 behaviors that occur that cost the most in terms of roadway fatalities and injuries. And we're glad to bring that to you. We offer it virtually right now, about once a month. In some form or fashion. We also have multiple webinars that address some of these topics as well. We know that when it comes to helping your employees understand and be empowered, training and conversations are really key. And we've got something called a co-pilot's rights that addresses a lot of those kind of awkward conversations to have if you're in the vehicle and somebody is doing something reckless or something that you think is compromising your safety. So the co-pilot's rights is really simple. That's a flyer that we can send you through a PDF. And we know also empowering those employees doesn't happen overnight. You've got to encourage them to see something and say something. And we know most people really don't want to do that. There's actually a good scientific evidence to show that your brain changes when you're asked to do something that's going to be resulting in an uncomfortable or negative conversation. And so it's natural to feel uneasy. And some of our dialogue and some of our preventive measures can help employees understand a little bit more about how to make those approaches. And it does get easier, doesn't it, Lisa? It does get easier to advocate for your safety once you put it into practice.
And a few people said yesterday, Cindy, that that's one thing they felt like they needed to do more of and do better of. And so understanding that when we don't speak up, you know, how will we feel when there is a crash that could be life-altering or, you know, be fatal, and we didn't speak up and we didn't help be a part of the solution? You know, that's impactful.
Absolutely. So I know, Lisa, you're going to talk a little bit more about policy directly and how to address some of these behaviors within policy.
Absolutely. And, you know, the video that you shared, Cindy, was perfect because, you know, former CEO and president of the National Safety Council, Deb Hirschman, really talked about 100% of your employees. And we set the stage earlier when we talked about each employee group needs to be addressed. So really, it's 100% of your employee population. And it's all handheld and all hands-free devices. You have to look at everything, you know, and just right, absolutely. All company vehicles. What about personal vehicles that you reimburse? Rental cars. All company cell phones and personal cell phones, and all work-related communications, even off hours, on hours. And we really need to think about everything that our employees do and how we keep them safe and how we are connecting with them. But written policies and procedures, we have to be very clear, and we also have to be enforceable and comprehensive, and it's got to be communicated to 100% of your employees. And one thing I do want to mention, a lot of companies, when employees are hired, they will sign that policy. They will sign whatever your policies are. They're real excited to have a job. A lot is going on at new employer orientation, but those policies may not be revisited again. And it's really important that you as a company have very clear, comprehensive, enforceable policies that you do enforce. And you can't enforce those policies only on Monday, Wednesday, and Friday, or only certain employees. And your management needs to help communicate that to all employees, all levels of management. And they need to help employees, and we need to make sure that all employees from the top down are following these policies and not just a certain group. And company cell phone policies, you've got to think about that. There is no decrease in productivity. The research and studies have shown that when you have that cell phone policy, that there is not a decrease in productivity. People want to say, but I have to be able to do it. What we know is that most of those calls are not business critical. They are not critical. And every employee and company will adapt to how the new normal would be without using those cell phones or that communication while driving. It's very easy to do. And drivers, it's not taking away. So it's important to know. And what about impact, right? Why are we doing it? It's got to have impact. It's really important. If we're going to do it, you have to know that it's impactful. And I made a comment a minute ago, it's got to be management and leaders top down. It's got to be everyone understands it, everyone follows it, and it has to be consistent and ongoing. Because if you're only, using those policies occasionally, it will not be effective. It's just like, working with kids and working with, kids when you want to change behaviors. You have to be consistent and ongoing, right? And so it's the same with adults. And people know when you follow policies, when you don't, who gets away with not following the policies. You'll hear about it when people say, well, I can't get the management to do it, or well, they don't, so I'm not going to. And so it's important to know if we want to be effective and we want to have impact, we've got to do it right. And to minimize the occurrence, you have to implement it, right? You have to actually do it. It can't be a binder that sits on a shelf with dust collecting on it. You've got to, you got to enforce it. You got to review it annually. You have to look at those policies annually, and you've got to modify as needed, and you need to improve. Cindy, when we do training and we do education, we're consistently evaluating, right? We're always evaluating. We're making updates. We're making changes. Because impact
Absolutely,
is important.
Lisa. A binder is a be-all, end-all, and it's a great reference point, but we know things are going to change, and that binder has to be updated. And like you mentioned, we are always updating what we're going to talk about to be more and more relevant because times change, and we're in particularly interesting times right now.
Absolutely. And we, as I said, following up, review and improve. Right? That's the only way. And we have to understand that it's got to be a comprehensive approach, and you need all of these. You need, those policies, and you need the education. They go hand in hand. You need to think about your driver safety program and your occupational safety program, and you need to think about your health and safety management system. And you need to think of it as a consistent and ongoing program, not a one and done. When somebody's hired, we're going to talk about it and we're not going to talk about it again. It's important that we keep both of those in the forefront and that they go hand in hand together.
Absolutely. And Lisa, we have a great resource here from the National Safety Council that we recommend you all look up on the cell phone kit, and what that really means for employers and how to make those first steps in the direction of changing your policy and making it firmer and more tight in terms of this particular topic. And when it comes to road safety, it's such a dynamic process, right? You want to look at those employees again in terms of policy change and making sure that they're trained on policy, and also to train them on awareness and make sure that they understand the risks that they're taking and what those risks mean and how to change them, how to alter how they're improve how they're driving overall. And all of that drives down not just the injury rate, but the severity of injury as well. And we know that when employees feel like you are concerned about their safety, morale improves, they stay longer, you have higher retention rate, which also is an impact on your bottom line, right? And your costs.
Absolutely.
Those claims and those liability issues are really key too, because if your employees don't know what those fantastic policies are that you've just written, what good are they going to be? And you can still land in litigation as the result. So, there's a lot of things that go into a safety program, Lisa. It's a lot more than a binder. And it's
Absolutely.
and it's also a lot more than just a one and done training. Getting messages in front of them Not taking them off the job to do so is really a key part of making your workplace safer.
Absolutely. How about let's wrap up with a few. I'm going to wrap up with just a couple takeaways real quick as we end our webinar this morning.
Sure.
But you know, we need our full attention for driving. We need 100% of our attention on the task at hand. You know, and that again, hands-free is not risk-free. So when we choose to allow Bluetooth or other devices or even handheld, you know, it's not risk-free. We are choosing risk at that point, right? And we know that risk exposure is what makes the biggest threat and the cost. And we know that that total ban is very important to an employer's bottom line and their liability and risk exposure. We know that.
Right. And you know, Lisa, we like to say there's no do-overs. When it comes to traffic safety and it comes to risk in terms of the drive, there are no ways that we can go back and fix something once it's already happened. So employers tell us all the time, I wish I'd known, I wish I could have prevented. We're here to help you mitigate these risks because
Absolutely.
we know that it's highly critical and there's no way to do something over again once it's been done.
Well, especially when there's a fatality or there's, you know, litigation, Cindy. I mean, once that door's been opened, you can't go back, right? And you go, I wish I would have, right? Hindsight's 2020, right? All of these things. So you're absolutely 100% correct. And so I know Cindy and I both would like to thank you for joining us this morning and tuning in to such an important topic that can hopefully help your safety program be a little stronger, take some key components back, use this as a safety talk, work with your managers and your leaders. Cindy and I's contact information is here. You can also look at txdrivingconcern.org for a lot of free resources that you can use in the workplace. You can also find more webinars, more trainings, safety talks, all of the things that will help complement your road safety program for a stronger culture at your company. So again, thank you for joining us and be safe.